In this video, we're going to have a look at how to fix shaky footage, which is a pretty common problem in any recording. So you can see as we play through this one, there's quite a bit of movement in the camera that's occurred as we were filming the actor. So After Effects has an inbuilt tool that allows you to basically reduce the amount of shake in your footage. So to get to this tool, you want to go into the effects window and search for the warp stabilizer. Now what the warp stabilizer is going to do is, through a process of scaling and cropping, it's going to remove the amount of shake in your footage. So warp stabilizer is found under the distort option in the effects panel, and when you drag it on, it will by default start stabilizing the footage. So to do this, it actually analyzes all of the footage in the clip and will try and create a consistent frame that removes the shakiness. So at the moment, it has some default presets that you can see in the left, which we can adjust these later on depending on the type of stabilization and the amount of shake in the footage. So it's just stabilizing our footage now, and once it's done, we'll be able to play through and see the result. So you can see it automatically scaled in a bit. So if we play through our footage now, you can see some of the options on the left. So we've got smooth motion clicked. Now the smoothness is set at 50%, and we're using a subspace warp, but there are different options for different things. And at the moment we've got stabilize, crop edges, and auto scale selected. So see, as we drag the slider through, the footage is quite stable at the moment, and it's one comparable thing to look for is the amount of shake above the actor's head, which is not much anymore compared to the original. If we wanted to adjust our footage further, we could actually adjust things like the amount of smoothness. So you'll notice the moment that I increase the smoothness, it goes back to stabilizing our footage, and the After Effects will start the process of analyzing and basically scaling and smoothing our footage again. So at 100% smoothness, the footage is even smoother. This should be one of the first things that you do when you're editing your footage, before you apply any visual effects, just so you don't create stuff that might be cropped out of the screen later. Alright, what we're going to do now is have a look at some animation basics in After Effects. So After Effects itself allows you to do a lot of animating, incorporating some skills from Flash, and allows you to bring in files from pretty much any other Adobe software, plus raw media files. So we're going to use this stock video footage today to play with some basics for animation. So over the top of this stock footage, we're going to put an image. So just going to use the i8 logo and drag it in. So if I drag that down into my composition, I want to have it on the top layer so that I can see it in front of my 16mm footage. And then we're going to play with some of the animation options. So we open up the drop down bar. On the left, you'll be able to see different properties of our i8 logo. Now I can freely move my logo around with my mouse, just as the image, and I can also scale it. So my options under my drop down menu in the transform window are things like the anchor point. So this is a point about which objects will scale and rotate. I've got my scale option, which is linked with the X and Y coordinates at the moment. So I'm just going to adjust my anchor point so that it's in the bottom corner, so when I scale, it doesn't scale about the middle of the object. And you'll see a change. Other options here, I have a position, so I can adjust an X and Y position using numerical values as opposed to dragging the mouse around the screen. I can also play with things like rotation and the opacity, which is the transparency of the object. Alright, so we're going to now create our little animation. To do so, I'm going to put my logo back in the center, and I'm going to move my anchor point back to the middle of my object, or approximate middle. So what we're going to look at now is keyframes and how we can use them to modify these basic positional qualities of an object, as well as the size, the scale, and the opacity. So we're going to start with a really small object, and then I'm going to turn my scale right down to 0 so the object doesn't exist on the screen, and click a keyframe. So you'll notice it's created a blue dot. And then I'm going to create another keyframe later in the footage by just changing the value of scale. So I'm going to set it to 120, and you'll notice there's now 2 blue dots, and when I move my slider, it is automatically tweened my object to fill in the path between the 2 settings that I've created, so 0 and 123. If I move my keyframe, I can also shorten the time or stretch the time over which this animation happens. Now I'm going to use the positional keyframe, so I've selected it from the 2-second mark, and I'm going to move it down. Now if I did that, it would automatically start from that bottom corner, which I don't want to happen, so I have to move my time slider. And then about 2-second intervals, I'm just going to set key positions around the viewing window. So you'll see I'll drop it into the bottom left-hand corner, then up to the top left, and then down to the bottom right. For each of these positions, it's created a keyframe which I can then adjust, or I could possibly delete as well. But if we slide back through the animation, you'll see that it's created different paths. Alright, I'm now going to play with rotation. So rotation has 2 values. If I adjust the degrees on the right, that just creates one, allows me to rotate between 0 and 360. If I set a value on the left, where it has the 1 times button, that means it's doing a full rotation in that time. So I'm going to set full rotations for a couple of keyframes, and then I want it to do 5 overall. So between the starting movement frame and the finishing movement frame, I want it to do 5 full rotations. So that's 5 revolutions of 360. You can see it automatically times it, creates quite a smooth path. Alright, to finish with now, we're just going to create another movement keyframe, so based on position. So I'm going to move my object back to the middle, and you can see it creates a positional keyframe without me telling it to. And then we're going to set the opacity. So keyframe the opacity, by default it's at 100. I'm going to set it to 0 to finish. So now if we watch my animation through, the logo scales up, moves to the bottom, performs a series of rotations before fading back into the background image of the clouds. Alright, now what we're going to do is drag our time back to the beginning, and we're going to look at some effects that we might apply to the background. So as I said, there's lots of effects in After Effects, and we're going to apply this to the background layer. So we're going to use the ripple from the distort, but we're going to drag it onto our background image. Now ripple creates the effect of dropping a coin in the water. To do this, we're actually going to turn off the top layer so that we can visibly see it. So if I adjust my radius, you can see there's a little ripple effect in the center. I can also adjust where the ripple starts by adjusting the center of the ripple and the radius that it's working in. I'm going to change mine to a symmetrical ripple and make my radius quite large. And you'll see it's starting to distort the edges of the footage. Next, I'm going to play with things like wave speed. So if I increase the wave speed, it means the ripple happens a lot quicker. And I can also play with things like wave height and width. So the wave height adjusts basically how much the footage distorts off the flat. So you'll see if I increase the wave height, it makes a really big ripple. If I increase the width, that's the distance between the ripple lines. So a wider width means a bigger ripple wave. Now the ripple phase is basically the repeat of how many ripples it's going to create. So by putting 10 ripple phase, it means it's going to essentially start from a small to a large ripple 10 times over. So you can see here I've just adjusted the height, and the deformations of the ripple have become quite big. So I'm going to keyframe the ripple height. I'm going to start it off quite small. And then I'm going to insert keyframes and increase the size of the ripple over time. So you should notice the distortion in the footage gets larger. Key thing to look for would be at the edges of the page, where at the top and bottom you can see as I get up to about 50, you'll notice some really big distortion. So that's just playing through my background with the ripple phase repeating, and I've adjusted the height. Now there's lots of different things we can do with this, but that pretty much leaves us here for this one.